Welcome to this wonderful presentation on a Tuesday night. Hope you're all getting ready for the upcoming holiday weekend. My name is John Harry. I'm the Executive Director of the Portage County Historical Society, and I just want to welcome you to this installment of the Talking Points Historical Education Programming Series, which is funded by a grant from the Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin. This one's virtual, we've had one other virtual presentation. If you want to check that one out, if you didn't get to see it, it's about the history of plover. So if you're on our YouTube channel or Facebook, you should be able to find it in the same place that you're watching this video. So if you want to see that, and then if you want to touch back on this presentation later, you can of course find this again too. Throughout tonight, you can put any questions in the comments if you have any like that. Before I let Miranda tell you about the major fires of Stevens Point, which we're really excited to learn more about, I'm just going to make a couple of announcements here. The first being that we have another talk coming up next month as part of this this programming series, and that is the Stevens Point Holiday Traditions Talk. That's a live in-person talk, but it's at Sunset Point Winery, which will make it tons of fun. So that's with Chelsea Piffner, whose last name might sound very familiar. Her family has roots stretching way back. And she's the host of the Historic Stevens Point Facebook page and website. So that's coming up on December 12th at 6 p.m. So we'll talk about holidays past of Stevens Point. The other thing I want to touch on is where I am right now, and that is the Beth Israel Synagogue Museum on Water Street in Stevens Point. We are open here noon to 4 after this weekend. So we're closed for Thanksgiving weekend, and then we're open Thursday through Saturdays, noon to 4, all the way up until Christmas. I'm just modeling some of our new merchandise. Look at that cool trucker hat and this awesome crew neck sweatshirt. Couldn't afford a better looking model. Really sorry about that. But we're not here to talk about anything else tonight than the major fires of Stevens Point. And so we're going to bring Miranda Solom into the stream here. And Miranda was an intern for us this summer for the Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin. The grant we got to put on these presentations, her internship was funded by that. And she, if you stop by the historic firehouse number 2 on Strong's, was the staff member there most of the time this summer. So if you saw her there, that's great. Otherwise, you get to hear from her right now. So if you have any questions, just pop those in the comments, even if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or whatever, and we'll get to those at the end. Miranda, though, graduated before last summer from UWSP. She was a history and a biology major, which is pretty impressive. And now she works at the Portage County Library, which is awesome. So without further ado, Miranda Solom, you take it away.
Thanks, John. I'm very excited to be here. The presentation, as he said, was about the major fires of Stevens Point. So it's called Conflagration Was Common. This word kind of sounds a little weird, but basically it just means an extensive fire that destroys a great deal of land or property. So this presentation will cover 8 major fires of Stevens Point history and how the city responded to those fires over time. So first we'll start off with a brief history of the city just to give you an idea of what was going on. So George Stevens passed through the area in 1839. The first houses were established in the 1840s. Oops, sorry about that typo there. By 1845, the Postal Service was established. 2 years later, the public square that we still know and love downtown was built in the surrounding area as well. And then the city was officially incorporated in 1858. Now, there were a lot of fires in Stevens Point history even before it became a city. And you can see a headline here from 1855. The headline is, of course, just another fire, because at this point there were so many of them happening that they weren't really a surprise anymore. But lumber was almost the rise and fall of Stevens Point because there were just so much wood everywhere that it burned so quickly. But the citizens quickly adapted to the issues and were able to figure out ways to save their city from destruction. All right. So This little section is the major fires. So this will cover 8 major fires. It's not a comprehensive list or ranking of the major fires. So if you don't see your favorite, don't hunt me down. But this will cover a century of Stevens Point history from 1865 as the first one here to 1965. So the first fire that we're going to talk about is the December 29th fire of 1865, and this occurred at the ANC hardware store. Um, the ANC hardware store caught fire. It spread to multiple other buildings from the public square over to 3rd Street, across Main Street, and a vast sheet of flames was said to have risen up and arched over the street, shooting solid columns of flames over 200 feet high. And the total loss of everything in the fire was $51,100, which at the time was a very large sum. The picture in the background here is what a hand pump fire engine would have looked like. So this is what they would have been using to fight this fire. All right. The next one is on December 28th. It was a Sunday in 1873. 19 buildings were burned, and the losses totaled $40,000. A broken kerosene lamp in the saloon of a Mr. McGee ignited a blaze around 9 p.m. Um, Unfortunately, there was time to save the fire, but the they weren't able to get the alarms sounded in time, and it lit up this whole strip of wooden buildings. And many people were very, very afraid that the entire downtown area was going to be lost. Um, the hand pump engine was brought to the scene, but it really wasn't able to make much of a difference. Eventually, as time passed, windows on the buildings were starting to blow out, and there wasn't much hope for the downtown area. But eventually, through hard work, they were able to extinguish the flames, um, but not after almost 20 different businesses in the downtown area were lost. Eventually, Michael McGee was actually convicted of arson for this fire, just because it was started in his building, and they blamed the broken kerosene lamp on him. The next one is going to be in 1877. Um, by this point, the city now purchased a steam fire engine because actually of the last fire, they noticed how damaging it was, and they decided that it was worth it to invest in an actual steam engine since the hand pump obviously wasn't able to fight off fires of this size. So on Monday, May 14th, 1877, what fire whistles sounded across the slough area of downtown, which is where all the lumber yards were. Um, and if you looked out over the water, people could see a very, very large, thick black cloud of smoke rising over the water. And by the time that they arrived on the scene, the EM Cops and Co. planing mill was nearly in ashes, and the surrounding lumber yards were quickly following. They tried to pull lumber out of the way, moving piles as quickly as they could, but all of the sawdust and the wood chips everywhere meant that it was very, very dangerous. And so they were having to cover their clothes in water to avoid succumbing to the intense heat of the fire. The whirlwinds that were caused by the heat and everything of the flame were carrying burning embers over a mile away into town. So they were having to put out all these little fires as well, which really wasn't good. The fire was described as being fierce as 10 furies and terrible as hell, which sounds pretty awful. Um, it destroyed over 4 million feet of lumber, totaling over $62,000, which is nearly $2 million today. And thankfully, despite all of this, there were no human deaths and there were only a few serious injuries, mainly of the firemen and the other people that were going in and trying to move the lumber around. All right. The next is on Tuesday, March 24th, 1885. This one, the article that I read was titled "A Big Blaze," so it must have been very large to stir such a title. In this fire, 9 different buildings were burned. It was discovered at first by policeman Ed Dunnigan. Supposedly, it was set maliciously in the rear of the saloon, but they never found out who did it. Um, a steam engine and a hand pump from the south side took up positions and worked for nearly 3 hours trying to put out the fire. But it became so quickly spread and they just couldn't get it under control. They were also trying to work from a well in town that was unfortunately filled with debris and farm runoff and who knows what else, and it eventually clogged the hoses of the engines. The hose of the South Side team, which is Firehouse number 2 pictured here, that was known as the South Side team. The hose of their engine burst not once, but twice, and they had to fix it and then try to pump it again, and it just wasn't working. In addition to this, there were also apparently many people that were just standing around. Um, the article said, stood around unthinking their help was needed or unwilling to work. So they just wanted to stand there and watch the people put out the fire, but not actually help them. The spread of the fire was um, moving pretty quickly, and a northwest breeze was carrying embers over towards 3rd Street, uh, starting those small fires that I talked about. Um, and eventually, it was stopped when it reached a wall of brick buildings, except to the south. To the south, it started burning rapidly, and that's where it burned through 2 different buildings on 3rd Street. Eventually, the blaze was finally stopped, actually in an alleyway next to what was at the time Demka's Bakery. The next fire was in 1885. In 1885, on May 3rd, between 1 and 2 a.m., the fire alarm was raised. They rushed to the scene. People were sprinting down the streets trying to follow the steam engines, and they eventually found that the source of the fire was a lumber yard at the corner of Wood and Charette Streets. There, the Heron and Wobbly planing mill had their very large lumber yard. There was also a sash and door company nearby. You can see this map down in the corner. Whoops, sorry. The map down in the corner has the different buildings that were in the nearby area. It has it labeled where the fire started, and you can see that obviously there was a lot of wood around, a lot of different businesses and sheds, storage locations. So the only solution was really to get both engines going as quickly as they could, but the well that they were pulling out of didn't have enough water, so they actually had to move one of the engines to a nearby creek. However, this required them to take both hoses and connect them together, so they only had one stream of water to fight. But with some people with buckets and everything, they were able to get the fire sort of under control. Buildings on the west side of Water Street were starting to be burned as well. People started to fear for their homes, so they started to take all their belongings outside, and they started hosing and dumping water on their roofs, trying to keep their homes from burning. By 4 a.m., the firemen had established a hand pump in addition to a hose, and they were starting to make some good headway against it. Again, the reporter mentioned that there were people standing around watching um, and not helping with the actual fire. But by about 4:30, 4:45, the fire reached its peak. It was described as a dreadful demon that fairly danced in glee over the ruin that he was working. People were very descriptive in how they talked about fire back then, which I think is very telling about how much of an issue it was that they had all these ways to describe it. But finally, by 5:15 a.m., the fire was contained and was no longer spreading, but the final flames weren't put out until noon of that day. So you can see up in the corner, there's a news article that describes the fire, um, and it talks about all of the different lumber and everything that was lost. It was a very, very destructive fire, um, but surprisingly, not the worst that we will see. The next one is one that you may have heard of before, and that was the Curran House fire in 1909 on February 21st. The Curran House was established by John and Henry Curran in 1864. The hotel caught flame around 8:30 p.m. and it started burning slowly up the west wall. The hotel really was not the easiest thing to fight a fire in. It was very cramped and small. There were a lot of rooms, a lot of floors, and a lot of furniture inside. Um, it was regarded as one of the nicest hotels in town. It was a place for distinguished guests. So when it started burning, people were very concerned. The fire was discovered by one of the dining room girls when it was still small, but the alarm, while it was raised, was not heard because it was mixed with the church bells. So people just assumed they were the church bells and that there wasn't a fire happening until they looked out their window and saw the building was burning. For a time, it seemed to be contained to the west side, and that it wouldn't spread, but eventually it did, and it wasn't actually put out until 3 a.m. the next day. As you can see in this picture, nearly half the house was destroyed, mainly the back half, so it's a little hard to see here. And they had to decide whether to spend an exorbitant amount of money trying to rebuild it and return it to its former glory, or if they would just tear it down. And eventually the decision was made to tear it down officially. This one here is the Clark Street Fire Bridge. It was known as the Wisconsin River Bridge Fire, as you can see in the picture there, and occurred on Wednesday, May 30th, 1923. Shortly after noon on May 30th, 1923, the bridge crossing the Wisconsin River in the downtown area caught fire. Is suspected that someone walking across the bridge tossed a burning something, maybe a cigarette or a cigar or something, onto the footpath, which was unfortunately covered in a substance called creosote, which is a wood preservative made from coal tar. It's highly flammable, so not great for a wooden bridge. The flame caught quickly right in the middle section of the bridge, and it started to burn outwards from there. Um, Once it started burning, there really wasn't much they could do about it. They tried to fight it from the water and actually went out on boats and tried to tether the boats to the supports of the bridge so that they could uh, shoot the water out of the hoses without getting pushed back by the force of it. So they were fighting two things at the same time, trying to fight the fire and also fighting um, the water and everything beneath them, trying to move them away from the fire itself. Eventually, after about an hour, one of the middle sections of the bridge where the fire started collapsed, and there really wasn't much they could do after that. The heat from the fire had melted the metal supports, and the whole structure eventually burned and had to be rebuilt. The last fire that we are going to talk about is the Hannon's Pharmacy fire in 1965. This occurred on Monday, January 11th, and actually it was three different businesses that were damaged. There was Hannon's Pharmacy and the dentist that shared the former building at 441 Main Street, as well as the next door business, which was the Continental Clothing Store. The fire was discovered at about 2 a.m. by a police officer, um, and it burned all the way through the next day's afternoon. It reduced the entire interior of the pharmacy to ash. There was really nothing left to save, even if they had wanted to, they couldn't. Um, it was January, so it was very, very cold. It was almost 0 degrees outside, and they had to use almost 750,000 gallons of water to put out the fire. So can imagine that there was a lot of icicles and slippery ice on the ground because even though the fire was there, it was still so cold out that the water that they were shooting was freezing. Um, the two businesses that were lost, Hannon's Pharmacy and the Continental Clothing Store, had both stood for over 50 years, so it was a very devastating loss at the time. Lieutenant Ray Steinke of the city fire department was almost seriously injured in this fire because he was standing on a stairway landing that collapsed and he almost fell through. And yeah. All right. So the next thing that we are going to talk about is how to fight a fire. Obviously, with all of these major fires that were happening, the city had to combat it in some way. And the different things that we're going to talk about are the trucks, the horses, fire gear, fire extinguishers, and trampolines. So the first trucks in the city were not really trucks, they were wagons pulled by horses, as you can see on the right side of the screen there. So they were pulled, some were hand pumped, some were steam engines. Um, but the city actually didn't have a team of horses, so they actually paid $5 to the first person that would show up with a team of horses to pull the engine every time that there was a fire, which meant that they weren't the quickest in response time. So eventually, the city did get around to getting a team of horses, but we'll talk about that in a second. The city's first steam engine was purchased in 1874. It cost $4,500, 4,500. Um, and the South Side engine, firehouse number two, was equipped with a new engine known as the General Ellis in 1885. Um, as I said, horses were required to pull the fire engines, at least back in the early days. The first team of horses was purchased for the fire department in 1877 for $382. They were kept at the firehouse and they were taken care of by the firefighters so that they were always on hand and they didn't have to wait around for someone to bring them horses to use. The fire department actually kept a team of horses on hand until 1924. Okay, so fire turnout gear, also known as burnout gear, bunker gear, um, is the top, pants, and hat that we all sort of recognize as a firefighter's uniform. Um, the history of the firefighter helmet dates back to about the 1730s in New York, when a man invented the earliest fire helmet. The modern shape that we sort of think of now, like the red plastic ones from the dollar store, were invented in 1836 by Henry Gradicap. By 1860, James Braidwood created a leather bag breathing apparatus for firefighters to use. So that was the first sort of primitive breathing device so that they could go into smoky areas without suffocating. The firefighter suits were originally made of wool in the 1860s and they consisted of wool pants, a long leather trench coat, and leather boots. By the mid 1930s, rubber slickers or like overcoats were commonly worn to keep the wool dry and to add extra protection. In the center here, and on the left side, you can see some different fire extinguishers. Extinguishers were really important invention because it meant that people could actually put out fires by themselves instead of just sort of watching them burn helplessly. So the first modern fire extinguisher was invented in 1818. You can see what that would have looked like over on the left side there. Um, this was the soda acid extinguisher was patented in the US in 1881. This chemical foam extinguisher in 1904, and the CO2 extinguisher in 1924. You can see the different evolution of the fire extinguishers on the side there, and then in the center is an old Babcock fire extinguisher ad. Um, People really liked these, they liked to have them around. There was a very enthusiastic like review in a newspaper about these fire extinguishers. And then the last item is the trampolines, which were also known as the Browder Life Safety Net. These were invented in 1887, but they became almost obsolete by the 1980s. People realized that they really weren't that effective, higher than 6 floors up. Firemen were frequently hit by people falling down. Jumpers usually missed the net, bounced off, or hit something on their way down. And they were really deemed unnecessary after the invention of the ladder truck, which was just far more efficient. So here in Stevens Point, there was kind of two different fire departments. There was the what was known as the Bucket Brigade, which was the unpaid volunteer department in the early days, and then the paid department later on. So the Bucket Brigade started in the 1850s, and they were also known as the Hook and Ladder Company. They were organized and they first met as an official group January 22nd in 1858. The group consisted of a large group of men from the surrounding area that just got together and decided one day that they were going to be the people that put out the fires. Um, an official group was not an official volunteer group, didn't actually put together until 1868. A second one arose on the south side for engine house number 2 that you can see on the right there around 1880. And by February 19th, 1892, this Common Council of the city decided to establish a paid department. They paid anywhere from $35 to $100 annually. And you can see a picture of the paid department in 1898 in the center there. The last thing I want to talk about is some changes to the city that were prompted by these fires. Um, the biggest thing was that they established burn limits to prevent extremely damaging fires. So they would put gaps in between buildings to prevent just like a long, extended burning. They also were very, very cautious about where they were putting piles of wood, who was using what in like kerosene, that sort of thing. And as you can see in this picture of the downtown area, they started using brick. They realized that using lumber all the time means that your buildings are going to burn down, and having large piles of wood everywhere means your buildings are going to burn down. So the city started to lean more into using brick, especially in the downtown area where it was very cramped. This picture is from 1905, and you can see it looks pretty similar to what it does nowadays, where most of the buildings are um, brick in some way. And so it meant that any fires that were starting in this area were really kept to whatever building they were starting in. All right. I think that is the end of the presentation.
Awesome job, Miranda. That was great. If you have any
Great.
questions, pop those right in the comments right now. We'll give you a second to do that. I'll ask a couple to start it off though, and that is, what was the most, I don't know, what's the thing that like stood out to you the most as you were doing the research for this presentation?
I was constantly amazed by how frequently the reporters brought up people standing around. I would have figured that in a city like this, where basically everyone was on an equal playing ground, like everyone's house was made of wood, everyone's belongings could burn, that people would have stuck together a little bit more in putting them out. But in a large portion of the research I did, I was able to find some mention of people just sort of standing there watching as buildings burned.
Yeah, that's always shocking. You covered a fire that I talk about on my downtown walking tours that I do
Mhm,
in the summer, and that's the Clark Street Bridge fire, the Wisconsin River
mhm,
Bridge fire. And just that there was like it was like it was like, you know, there wasn't a lot of entertainment or something, so we're gonna go watch this
mhm,
huge blaze destroy people's
yeah.
livelihoods, which is pretty crazy. You're getting a lot of
Mhm.
applause from
Oh,
people.
good.
So not questions, but people just very happy with the presentation. Um,
Great.
yeah, I think it's so interesting that just how many there were,
Mhm.
which
Yeah,
is
this doesn't even touch the surface of how many
right.
there were.
Right. So some of the research I know you got from this book we have right here,
Hmm.
which is the major fires in the early days of Stevens Point. So it covers more of the early stuff, which is for sale at the bookshop, which is open Thursdays through Saturdays here at the Beth Israel Synagogue Museum. But yeah, what stood out? Why did you choose these fires over the other ones?
Uh, it was kind of a little of an arbitrary process, I'll be honest. Um, but these were just sort of ones that as I was flipping through that book and as I was scrolling through different um, articles and things, they sort of stood out to me as um, ones that I know that if I had been present during them, they would have really stuck in my mind.
Sure,
Um, and if I had had the time, I would have included so many more, but
sure.
had to keep it short. So,
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And if anybody like I said, we have the book. If anybody wants to learn, more, it's just a kind of an entry point. So Juliana, let's pop back your presentation here.
mhm.
So the Juliana is asking on Facebook, the first fire you covered. So you want to get back to that slide. Um,
This one?
yeah. So we're trying to figure out. She wants to know if we can figure out where that was. So
Um,
if it's spread to multiple from Public Square to Third Street and across Main Street, so that would be like right near the Public Square and Third Street. So like right where the Gruba Jewelers building,
mhm,
well, it's not Gruba Jewelers anymore, but that building, I think, obviously that's made of stone, so it's still here. Yeah, okay, that's good.
mhm.
Um, and oh, she's saying the saloon fire. There's a few of that had to do with saloons.
Ooh,
Mr. McGee,
yeah.
where was that? I'm
This
guessing. Yeah. Do you have
Oh,
a
go ahead.
no? Go ahead if you have a location.
I was unable to find an exact location,
Sure.
um, but it was, I believe, on one of those, like, side streets off of the public square,
Sure.
but I'm not sure exactly where.
Well, and that makes sense too because and you have a picture there of the North Side Firehouse.
Mhm.
And that was the one before they put the South Side one up too, but that was not far off of the square. And unfortunately,
Yes.
that doesn't exist anymore. Okay, cool. Let's see what else we got here. We got one more question, I think, and that is, do you know when Firehouse number 1 went out of service?
Firehouse number 1, I believe they stopped using it in 1967?
Okay.
That the correct year?
I think that's a good. I know it was I think it was the late 1960s. I think you're right on
Okay.
there because I think that building then became, and this is just stuff that I happen to know, became part of the Sherrill Tire stuff.
Mhm.
So like it was a storehouse for that. I could be totally wrong, and somebody's gonna get really mad at me for that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it used to be. So, well, anyway, well, great job, Miranda. Thanks for being an awesome intern all summer long, and we hope to see you again.
Thanks
Um,
for having me.
yeah, and Juliana's giving you some props too. So yeah. Oh yeah, here's one
Great.
more question: Is did the city really use horses for firefighting in the 1920s? Yes.
Yes, they did.
We Yeah, yep. So that's pretty crazy. It's 100 years ago, but it's not that doesn't seem that long ago. So, well, thanks,
Yeah.
Miranda.
Thank you.
You have a happy Thanksgiving. Everybody out there in internet land, have a happy Thanksgiving. And again, I'll just plug real quick. The next presentation is Stevens Point Holiday Traditions coming up on the 12th of December at 6 o'clock at Sunset Point Winery. So hope to see everybody there. And otherwise, we will see you all again, hopefully soon. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.